The morning sun painted golden streaks across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as 9-year-old Prince George walked quietly through the courtyard. His small footsteps echoed softly against the ancient stones, a sound that had become familiar to everyone who worked within these historic walls. Today felt different, though, and George could sense it in the way the staff moved around him with extra care. James Mitchell had been standing guard at the castle gates for 15 years. His tall frame and serious expression made him look like he belonged in the pages of a history book, but his eyes always softened when he saw the young prince approaching. George had a way of bringing warmth to even the most formal places, and James had watched him grow from a curious toddler into the thoughtful boy he was becoming. On this particular Tuesday, George noticed something that others might have missed. As he walked past the main entrance, he saw James standing at his usual post, but something was wrong. The guard's shoulders seemed heavier than usual, and there was a sadness in his posture that George had never seen before. Most people would have simply walked by, but George was not like most people. Even at his young age, he had learned to pay attention to the people around him. The royal family had always taught George that being a prince meant more than wearing fancy clothes or living in a castle. His parents, Prince William and Princess Catherine, often reminded him that true nobility came from caring about others and treating everyone with kindness and respect. These lessons had shaped George's character in ways that surprised even his parents. George slowed his pace as he approached James. The guard immediately straightened up and prepared to give his usual formal bow, but George raised his small hand gently, signaling that such formality was not needed. Instead, the young prince simply stood there for a moment, studying James's face with the kind of innocent wisdom that children sometimes possess. James had been having the worst week of his life. His wife Sarah had been diagnosed with a serious illness just 3 days earlier. The doctors had explained that she would need extensive treatment, and the medical bills would be overwhelming. James had been trying to figure out how he could possibly afford everything while continuing to work his demanding job at the castle. The stress was eating away at him, and he had barely slept since receiving the news. What made everything worse was that James felt completely alone with his problems. He was a proud man who had always taken care of his family without asking for help from anyone. The idea of burdening others with his troubles went against everything he believed in. So he had been suffering in silence, trying to maintain his professional appearance while his world was falling apart inside. George had always been observant, but today, his attention was particularly focused on James. There was something about the way the guard held himself that reminded George of how his own grandfather had looked during difficult times. Prince Philip had taught George that sometimes the strongest people needed the most support, even if they would never ask for it. Without saying a word, George walked closer to James. The guard looked down at the young prince, expecting to receive instructions about some royal duty, or perhaps a question about castle security. Instead, George simply looked up at him with those clear, honest eyes that seemed to see straight into a person's heart. George had learned many things about being royal, but the most important lesson came from watching his parents interact with people from all walks of life. He had seen how a simple gesture of genuine concern could change someone's entire day. He had watched his mother comfort grieving families and seen his father encourage struggling veterans. These examples had taught George that true power came from using your position to help others, not to show off. The castle staff had always been fond of George, but they treated him with the formal respect that his position required. James was no different. He had always maintained proper protocol when dealing with any member of the royal family. But today, something in George's manner suggested that protocol might not be the most important thing. George took another small step closer to James. The morning air was crisp, and the sound of other guards and staff members going about their duties created a gentle background noise. But in this moment it felt like the entire world had narrowed down to just the two of them standing there together. James found himself wondering what the young prince was thinking. In all his years of service, he had never experienced anything quite like this. George was not behaving like a typical royal child who might demand attention or expect immediate service. Instead, there was something almost protective in the way George was looking at him, as if the boy somehow understood that James was going through something difficult. The guard's training told him to maintain his professional composure at all times, but George's presence was having an unexpected effect on him. There was something so genuine and caring about the young prince that it was becoming harder for James to keep his emotions locked away. He could feel his carefully constructed walls beginning to weaken under the gentle pressure of George's concerned attention. George had noticed that James's hands were shaking slightly, and his eyes looked tired in a way that suggested he had not been sleeping well. The young prince had seen this same look on the faces of people who visited his parents during their charitable work. It was the look of someone who was carrying a burden that was too heavy to bear alone. As the minutes passed, the two of them continued to stand there in comfortable silence. Other staff members walked by, but they seemed to instinctively understand that something important was happening and chose not to interrupt. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting longer shadows across the courtyard, but neither George nor James seemed to notice the passage of time. Finally, George did something that would be talked about in the castle for years to come. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. James watched in confusion as the young prince carefully unfolded it and held it out to him. The guard hesitated for a moment before taking the paper and reading what was written on it in George's careful handwriting. The note was simple, written in the careful handwriting of a 9-year-old boy who had taken time to make each letter clear and readable. It said, "Dear James, I notice you seem worried about something important. If you need help, please know that you are not alone. Some problems are too big to carry by yourself. Your friend, George." James stared at the paper in his hands, reading the words over and over again. His vision began to blur as tears formed in his eyes. In 15 years of royal service, he had received countless orders, instructions, and formal communications, but nothing had ever affected him like these few simple sentences from a child who had taken the time to notice his pain. The guard's first instinct was to maintain his professional composure. He quickly wiped his eyes and tried to hand the note back to George, but the young prince shook his head gently and folded James's fingers back around the paper. There was something so mature and understanding in George's expression that it took James's breath away. George had spent considerable time thinking about what to write in that note. He had seen enough grown-ups in his life to know that sometimes people needed permission to accept help. His grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had once told him that true leadership meant making it safe for others to be vulnerable when they needed support. James looked down at George and realized that this moment was going to change everything. The young prince had somehow seen through all his carefully maintained defenses and recognized that he was struggling. More importantly, George had taken action to let James know that someone cared about what happened to him. The weight of keeping his problems secret had been crushing James for days. He had been walking around the castle feeling invisible, as if his personal struggles were completely separate from his professional life. But George's simple gesture had suddenly made him feel seen and valued as a human being, not just as a uniformed guard standing at his post. George could see that James was fighting with himself about whether to say anything. The young prince had learned from his parents that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was give someone space to make their own choice about sharing their troubles. So he simply stood there patiently, letting James know through his presence that whatever the guard decided would be okay. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, James made a decision that went against every instinct he had developed during his years of royal service. He looked down at George and said quietly, "Your Royal Highness, my wife is very sick, and I don't know how we're going to manage everything that needs to be done for her treatment." The words came out in a rush, as if James had been holding them inside for so long that they needed to escape all at once. Once he started talking, he found it impossible to stop. He told George about the diagnosis, about the medical bills, about his fears for his wife's future, and about his feeling of helplessness in the face of circumstances beyond his control. George listened to every word with the kind of focused attention that most adults would find impressive in someone 3 times his age. He did not interrupt or try to offer quick solutions. Instead, he simply absorbed what James was telling him and let the guard know through his body language that he was being heard and understood. When James finished speaking, he immediately began to apologize for burdening a child with adult problems, but George stopped him with a gentle shake of his head and said something that James would remember for the rest of his life. "James, my parents taught me that we're all people first, and our jobs come second. You're not just a guard to me, you're James, and James is worried about someone he loves very much." The simplicity and wisdom of George's response left James speechless. Here was a 9-year-old boy who understood something about human dignity that many adults spent their entire lives trying to learn. George was not looking at James as the employee who had overstepped boundaries by sharing personal information. Instead, he was seeing him as a fellow human being who was going through a difficult time. George then did something that surprised even himself. He asked James if he would be willing to wait there for a few minutes while George went to find his parents. The young prince explained that his mother and father had always told him that when someone was facing a serious problem, it was important to connect them with people who might be able to help in ways that a child could not. James started to protest, saying that he could not possibly bother the prince and princess with his personal affairs. But George was already walking toward the castle entrance. The young prince moved with a sense of purpose that made it clear he was not going to be talked out of what he was planning to do. As George disappeared into the castle, James stood there holding the note and wondering what he had gotten himself into. Part of him wanted to simply return to his post and pretend that this conversation had never happened. But another part of him felt lighter than he had in days, as if sharing his burden with George had somehow made it more manageable. The other guards and staff members who had witnessed this unusual interaction were talking quietly among themselves. Everyone knew that something significant had just occurred, but no one was quite sure what it meant or what would happen next. James could feel their eyes on him, but for the first time in days he did not feel ashamed of his situation. Inside the castle, George was making his way through the familiar corridors with determined steps. He knew exactly where to find his parents at this time of day, and he had a clear plan for what he wanted to say to them. The young prince had learned from experience that grown-ups responded best when children presented problems, along with suggested solutions. George found his parents in the morning room, reviewing their schedules for the upcoming week. Prince William was discussing a charity event, while Princess Catherine was making notes about an upcoming school visit. When they saw George approaching with such serious expression, they immediately gave him their full attention. The young prince did not waste time with small talk. He sat down across from his parents and explained exactly what had happened with James. George told them about noticing that the guard seemed troubled, about writing the note, and about learning what James was going through with his wife's illness. Prince William and Princess Catherine listened to their son's account with growing amazement. They were proud of George for noticing someone else's distress and taking action to help, but they were also impressed by the mature way he was handling the entire situation. George was not asking his parents to solve James's problems for him. Instead, he was asking for their guidance about the best way to provide support. Princess Catherine exchanged a meaningful look with Prince William as George finished explaining the situation. Both parents recognized that their son had demonstrated exactly the kind of compassion and leadership they had been trying to teach him. George had not only noticed someone in need, but he had acted with wisdom and sensitivity that many adults would struggle to match. Prince William leaned forward and placed a gentle hand on George's shoulder. "You did exactly the right thing, George. James has been part of our castle family for many years, and when family members are struggling, we help them however we can." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and George felt a warm glow of satisfaction knowing that his parents approved of his actions. Princess Catherine added, "What you've shown today is true royal behavior, George. Being royal is not about living in a castle or wearing crowns. It's about using whatever advantages we have to make life better for the people around us." She smiled at her son with genuine admiration for his mature handling of such a delicate situation. The three of them spent the next few minutes discussing the best way to approach James's situation. George listened carefully as his parents explained the importance of helping people in a way that preserved their dignity and did not make them feel embarrassed about accepting assistance. This was a lesson that would stay with George for the rest of his life. Prince William suggested that they should start by having a private conversation with James to better understand exactly what kind of support would be most helpful. He explained to George that different people had different needs, and the best way to help someone was to ask them what would make the biggest difference in their situation. George nodded thoughtfully and asked if he could be present during this conversation. His parents looked at each other again, realizing that their son's involvement in this situation was turning into an important learning experience for him. They agreed that George could participate, as long as he understood that this was a serious adult matter that required maturity and respect. The three of them made their way back to the courtyard where James was still standing at his post. The guard saw them approaching and immediately straightened into his most formal posture, but Prince William quickly signaled that this would be an informal conversation. He suggested that they move to a private area where they could speak more comfortably. James followed them to a small sitting area in one of the castle's quiet gardens. The setting was peaceful and private, with flowers blooming around them and birds singing in the nearby trees. The informal atmosphere helped James relax slightly, though he was still overwhelmed by the idea that members of the royal family were taking time out of their busy schedule to discuss his personal problems. Prince William began the conversation by thanking James for his many years of dedicated service to the family. He explained that George had shared his concerns about James's current situation, and the family wanted to know if there was any way they could provide support during this difficult time. James looked at George with gratitude and amazement. The young prince had not only listened to his problems, but he had also taken action to connect him with people who might be able to help. James had never imagined that his personal struggles would become a matter of concern for the royal family. But George's compassion had opened a door he never knew existed. With Prince William's gentle encouragement, James found himself explaining his wife's medical situation in more detail. He talked about the expensive treatments that would be needed, the time he would need to take off work to care for her, and his fears about their financial future. As he spoke, he was struck by how carefully the entire family listened to every word he said. Princess Catherine asked thoughtful questions about Sarah's condition and the timeline for her treatment. Her genuine concern for someone she had never met impressed James deeply. It was clear that this was not just a polite conversation for the sake of appearances, but a sincere attempt to understand how they could make a meaningful difference in his family's life. George remained quiet during most of this conversation, but his presence was important to James. The guard kept thinking about how this entire situation had started with a 9-year-old boy who had simply taken the time to notice that someone was struggling. George's kindness had set everything else in motion. As the conversation continued, Prince William explained that the castle employed many people who had become like family over the years. He said that when family members were facing serious challenges, it was natural and appropriate for the royal household to provide whatever support was possible. This was not charity, he emphasized, but simply what families did for each other. James felt tears forming in his eyes again as he realized that these powerful and privileged people were treating him as an equal human being worthy of their concern and assistance. The formal barriers that usually existed between the royal family and their staff had temporarily disappeared, replaced by genuine human compassion. Princess Catherine suggested several concrete ways they could help. The royal household maintained an emergency fund specifically designed to assist staff members facing unexpected medical expenses. Additionally, James could be given flexible work arrangements that would allow him to spend time with his wife during her treatment without losing income. George listened to his parents, outlined these solutions, and felt proud to be part of a family that took such good care of the people who worked for them. He was learning that true nobility meant taking responsibility for the well-being of others, especially those who depended on you for their livelihood. The conversation lasted for nearly an hour, with Prince William and Princess Catherine carefully working out the details of how they could best support James and his wife. They insisted that all assistance would be handled privately and discreetly, so James would not feel uncomfortable about his situation becoming common knowledge among the other staff members. As the meeting came to a close, James tried to find words to express his gratitude, but his emotions made it difficult to speak clearly. Prince William simply shook his hand and said, "James, you've taken care of our family for 15 years. Now let us take care of yours for a while." George stood up and approached James one more time. The young prince looked up at the guard and said quietly, "James, I hope your wife gets better soon. Please tell her that we're all thinking about her." The simple sincerity of George's words touched James more deeply than any formal speech could have. As they prepared to leave the garden, Princess Catherine turned back to James and added, "Please keep us informed about how Sarah is doing. We genuinely care about both of you, and we want to know that you're getting through this difficult time." Her words reinforced that this was the beginning of ongoing support, not just a one-time gesture. James watched the royal family walk away and realized that his life had just changed in ways he never could have imagined. What had started as the worst week of his life was turning into something entirely different, all because a 9-year-old prince had taken the time to notice his pain and act with extraordinary compassion. Over the following weeks, the entire atmosphere at Windsor Castle seemed to change. Word of George's thoughtful gesture and his parents' generous response had spread quietly among the staff, creating a new sense of warmth and mutual care throughout the ancient building. People began looking out for each other more carefully, inspired by the example set by their youngest royal family member. James found himself in an extraordinary position. For the first time since his wife's diagnosis, he was able to focus on being a loving husband, rather than constantly worrying about money and logistics. The financial support from the royal household had eliminated the crushing stress of medical bills, while his new flexible schedule allowed him to accompany Sarah to her treatments and be present during her recovery period. Sarah herself was amazed when James told her about George's intervention and the family's response. She had been feeling guilty about the burden her illness was placing on her husband, but learning that people genuinely cared about their situation gave her strength during the most difficult moments of her treatment. She often asked James to express her gratitude to George and his parents. George, meanwhile, was learning important lessons about the long-term nature of helping others. His parents explained that true assistance was not just about solving immediate problems, but about providing ongoing support and maintaining relationships with people who had become part of their extended family. George began checking on James regularly, always asking about Sarah's progress. The young prince's behavior during this period impressed everyone who witnessed it. George never treated James differently because of their new relationship, and he never acted as if the guard owed him anything special because of the help his family had provided. Instead, George simply continued to be friendly and respectful, treating James exactly as he had before, while also showing genuine interest in his wife's recovery. James noticed that other staff members were beginning to treat him with a new kind of respect. They had always been professional colleagues, but now there was a sense of family connection that had not existed before. People asked about Sarah's health, offered to cover his shifts when needed, and generally made him feel supported by the entire castle community. One afternoon, about a month after the initial conversation, George approached James with a small wrapped package. The guard looked puzzled as George handed it to him with a shy smile. Inside the package was a beautiful hand-knitted scarf in soft blue wool, along with a note that read, "For Sarah, with best wishes for her recovery, from George and his whole family." James was deeply moved by this thoughtful gift. George explained that he had asked his mother to help him choose something that might bring comfort to Sarah during her difficult treatments. Princess Catherine had suggested the scarf because it was both practical and beautiful, something Sarah could wear when she needed to feel wrapped in caring thoughts from people who were thinking about her. When James brought the scarf home that evening, Sarah cried tears of joy and gratitude. She could hardly believe that a young prince and his family were thinking about her personally and taking time from their important duties to show that they cared. The scarf became her most treasured possession, and she wore it to every medical appointment as a reminder that she was not facing her illness alone. George began asking James more detailed questions about Sarah's treatment and recovery process. The young prince was genuinely curious about what it was like for families dealing with serious illness, and James found himself becoming an informal teacher, helping George understand the challenges that ordinary people faced when health problems disrupted their lives. These conversations were having a profound impact on George's understanding of the world outside his privileged royal environment. Through James's experiences, George was learning about the healthcare system, about the financial pressures that medical emergencies could create, and about the emotional toll that illness took on entire families. This education would shape his future approach to charitable work and public service. Prince William and Princess Catherine were quietly observing their son's development during this period, and they were impressed by his sustained interest in James's situation. Many children might have lost interest after the initial excitement of helping someone, but George continued to show genuine concern and involvement. Weeks later, the royal couple decided to use this situation as an opportunity to teach George more about the responsibilities that came with their family's position. They began taking him to visit other staff members who were dealing with various challenges, showing him how the royal household traditionally supported its extended family of employees and their loved ones. George discovered that his family maintained an entire network of assistance for people who worked at the castle and other royal properties. There were scholarships for staff members' children, emergency funds for unexpected crises, housing assistance for those in need, and medical support for families facing health challenges. George had never realized how many people his family was quietly helping behind the scenes. This new awareness gave George a deeper appreciation for what it meant to be royal. He began to understand that his privileged position came with real responsibilities to care for others, and that true nobility was measured by how effectively he used his advantages to improve other people's lives. These were lessons that would guide him throughout his future role as a member of the royal family. James, meanwhile, was experiencing something he had never expected in his professional life. He was beginning to feel like a valued member of a caring community, rather than simply an employee doing a job. The transformation in his relationship with the royal family had opened his eyes to possibilities he had never imagined. As Sarah's treatment progressed, her health began to improve steadily. The doctors were pleased with her response to the medical interventions, and her prognosis was becoming increasingly positive. James knew that her recovery was due to many factors, but he could not help feeling that the reduced stress and increased support from the royal family had played an important role in her healing process. George continued to check on James regularly, and the guard found himself looking forward to these brief conversations. The young prince had a gift for asking exactly the right questions and listening with the kind of focused attention that made James feel truly heard and valued. Their relationship was developing into a genuine friendship that transcended their formal roles. One day, Sarah felt well enough to write her own thank you note to George. She carefully crafted a letter expressing her gratitude for his kindness and explaining how much his thoughtfulness had meant to her during the most difficult period of her life. She wanted him to know that his small gesture of concern had made an enormous difference in her family's experience of a very challenging time. When George received Sarah's letter, he was deeply moved by her words. He had not fully realized the impact that his simple note to James had created, and learning about it from Sarah's perspective gave him a new understanding of how powerful small acts of kindness could be when they came from the heart. As autumn arrived at Windsor Castle, the relationship between George and James had evolved into something beautiful and lasting. The young prince had learned to see beyond the formal uniforms and protocols to recognize the individual human beings who dedicated their lives to serving his family. James, in turn, had discovered that royal service could involve genuine mutual care and respect, rather than simply one-sided duty. Sarah's recovery had progressed remarkably well, and her doctors were cautiously optimistic about her long-term prognosis. The financial stress that had been crushing James during those first frightening weeks was now a distant memory, replaced by gratitude and a renewed sense of hope for the future. He knew that his family's story could have been very different without the intervention of a compassionate 9-year-old prince. George had begun incorporating regular visits with castle staff into his weekly routine. Inspired by his experience with James, he started paying attention to other employees who might be facing challenges in their personal lives. His parents encouraged this interest, recognizing that George was developing the kind of genuine concern for others that would serve him well throughout his future royal duties. One October morning, James received news that would change everything once again. Sarah's latest medical tests showed that her treatment had been completely successful. She was officially in remission, and her doctors believed that with continued monitoring she had an excellent chance of full recovery. James could hardly believe that the nightmare that had begun just a few months earlier was finally coming to an end. When James shared this wonderful news with George, the young prince's face lit up with pure joy. George had been following Sarah's progress closely, and he felt genuinely invested in her recovery. The prince immediately asked if he could write another note to Sarah, this time to congratulate her on her successful treatment and express his happiness about her improving health. George's second note to Sarah was even more heartfelt than his first message to James. He wrote about how proud he was of her courage during treatment and how happy it made him to know that she was getting better. He also mentioned that he had been learning a lot about helping people through difficult times, and that meeting her family had taught him important lessons about kindness and community. James was struck by the maturity and wisdom in George's words. The young prince had somehow managed to transform a personal crisis into a learning experience that was making him a better person and a more effective member of the royal family. James realized that he had not only received help during his family's difficult time, but he had also played a role in educating the future king about the importance of compassion and service. Princess Catherine and Prince William had been observing their son's development throughout this entire experience, and they were deeply proud of how George had handled himself. They could see that he was internalizing important values about leadership, responsibility, and human dignity that would guide him throughout his life. George was learning to be royal in the best possible way. The castle staff had also been watching George's behavior, and many of them had been inspired by his example. People began looking out for each other more carefully, offering help to colleagues who were struggling, and creating a sense of community that had not existed before. George's simple act of noticing someone in pain had created ripples of kindness throughout the entire castle environment. However, James was also experiencing some unexpected feelings during this period. While he was profoundly grateful for everything that had happened, he was also beginning to feel conflicted about his role at the castle. The extraordinary kindness he had received from the royal family had made him acutely aware of the enormous gap between their resources and his own situation as a working-class employee. James had always taken pride in his ability to handle his own problems and provide for his family through his own efforts. Although he was deeply thankful for the help he had received, he was also struggling with feelings of dependence that were new and uncomfortable for him. He began to question whether he could continue in a job where his employers had become his benefactors. These feelings came to a head during a quiet conversation with his wife. Sarah, who was now feeling much stronger and more like herself, listened carefully as James explained his internal conflict. She understood that her husband was a man who needed to feel that he was earning his place in the world through his own merit and hard work. Sarah gently suggested that perhaps James was looking at the situation in the wrong way. She pointed out that the royal family had not treated him as a charity case, but rather as a valued member of their extended family who deserved support during a crisis. She reminded him that he had given 15 years of loyal service to the family, and that their assistance was a recognition of his worth, not a sign of his inadequacy. Despite Sarah's wise words, James continued to wrestle with his conflicted feelings. He loved his job and respected the royal family enormously, but he was finding it difficult to return to the simple employer-employee relationship that had existed before George's intervention. Everything felt different now, and James was not sure how to navigate this new reality. George, with his characteristic perceptiveness, began to notice that something was troubling James. The guard was still friendly and professional, but there was a tension in his demeanor that had not been there before. George mentioned his observations to his parents, wondering if there was something more they should be doing to help James feel comfortable. Prince William recognized what was happening immediately. He had seen this reaction before in other staff members who had received significant assistance from the royal family. Some people found it difficult to maintain their sense of independence and self-respect after accepting help, even when that help had been freely and generously given. The prince decided to have another private conversation with James, this time to address the guard's emotional struggles directly. Prince William understood that James needed to feel valued for his professional contributions, not just appreciated as someone who had received charity. The royal family would need to be sensitive to James's need to maintain his dignity and sense of purpose. During their conversation, Prince William acknowledged James's feelings and validated his need to feel independent and self-sufficient. The prince explained that the royal family had not helped James's family out of pity, but because they genuinely cared about him as a person and valued his many years of dedicated service. The assistance had been a way of honoring their relationship, not creating dependence. Prince William also shared something that surprised James. He explained that the royal family actually learned important lessons from their relationships with staff members like James. George's experience of helping during Sarah's illness had taught him valuable things about leadership and compassion that could not be learned any other way. In many ways, James had given the family a gift by allowing them to be part of his journey. This conversation helped James begin to see the situation from a different perspective. Perhaps he was not just someone who had received help, but someone who had also given something valuable in return. His willingness to accept assistance had created opportunities for the royal family to live up to their highest values, and for George to develop into a more thoughtful and caring future leader. Despite Prince William's thoughtful words and reassurances, James found that his internal conflict continued to grow stronger over the following weeks. He lay awake at night thinking about his position at the castle, and questioning whether he could ever feel truly comfortable in his role again. The gratitude he felt toward the royal family was immense, but it was accompanied by a growing sense that he needed to make a change in his life. Sarah noticed her husband's restlessness and encouraged him to think carefully about what would make him feel most at peace with himself. She reminded him that there was no shame in accepting help when it was needed, but she also understood that James was the kind of man who needed to feel that he was standing on his own feet. Whatever decision he made, she would support him completely. James began to realize that his feelings were not really about ingratitude or shame. Instead, they were about his need to move forward in his life from a position of strength rather than dependence. The royal family had given him and Sarah a precious gift by helping them through their crisis. And now James wanted to use that gift to build something new and independent for his future. After much reflection, James made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He requested a meeting with Prince William and Princess Catherine to discuss his future at the castle. When they met in the same garden where they had first talked about Sarah's illness, James explained that he was considering resigning from his position to pursue new opportunities that would allow him to support his family independently. Prince William and Princess Catherine listened carefully to James's explanation, and they found themselves respecting his reasoning, even as they regretted the possibility of losing such a valued staff member. They understood that James needed to feel that he was providing for his family through his own efforts, and they appreciated his honesty about his internal struggles. George was included in this conversation at his own request. The young prince had been thinking deeply about his relationship with James and the lessons he had learned from the entire experience. George wanted to make sure that James knew how much their friendship had meant to him and how much he had grown as a person because of what had happened between them. James was deeply moved when George spoke about their relationship. The young prince explained that helping James and Sarah had taught him more about leadership and compassion than any formal lesson could have provided. George said that he would always be grateful to James for allowing him to learn what it really meant to care for other people, and to use his position to make a positive difference in their lives. During their conversation, James shared an idea that had been growing in his mind. He explained that his experience with the royal family had inspired him to pursue a career in social work, helping other families navigate medical crises and financial challenges. The support he had received had shown him how transformative the right kind of assistance could be, and he wanted to spend his future providing that same kind of help to others who needed it. Princess Catherine was immediately interested in James's plans. She asked detailed questions about his career goals and offered to help him connect with organizations that specialized in supporting families facing medical emergencies. The princess explained that the royal family maintained relationships with many charitable organizations that would value someone with James's experience and compassion. Prince William suggested that James did not need to see his departure from castle service as the end of his relationship with the royal family. Instead, his new career could represent an extension of the values they all shared about caring for others and using whatever resources they had to improve people's lives. James would be carrying the spirit of royal service into a new arena where he could help even more families. George asked if he could stay in touch with James even after he left the castle. The young prince was genuinely interested in learning about social work and the challenges that ordinary families faced when dealing with serious problems. George felt that maintaining a friendship with James would help him continue learning important lessons about the world outside his royal environment. James was touched by George's request and gladly agreed to maintain their friendship. He realized that their relationship had evolved far beyond the formal boundaries between a royal prince and a castle guard. George had become someone James genuinely cared about, and he looked forward to watching the young prince continue growing into the kind of leader who would make a positive difference in the world. As news of James's planned departure spread quietly through the castle, The reaction from other staff members was overwhelmingly supportive. People understood his reasoning and respected his decision to pursue a path that would allow him to help other families while maintaining his sense of independence. Many colleagues expressed interest in staying connected with James as he moved into his new career. Sarah was proud of her husband's decision and excited about their future together. Her recovery had been so successful that she was able to return to work part-time, and the couple felt optimistic about their ability to build a stable, independent life. The crisis that had brought them to the edge of despair had somehow transformed into an opportunity for growth and new possibilities. The royal family organized a private farewell gathering for James that was both touching and celebratory. They presented him with a letter of recommendation that highlighted his years of dedicated service and his personal qualities of integrity, compassion, and reliability. More importantly, they gave him their blessing as he embarked on his new career path and their promise of ongoing friendship. George's contribution to the farewell celebration was especially meaningful. The young prince had prepared a short speech in which he thanked James for teaching him about courage, kindness, and the importance of noticing when other people needed help. George promised to carry these lessons with him throughout his life and to look for ways to follow James's example of turning personal experience into service to others. On James's final day at Windsor Castle, he stood once more at the gates where his journey with the royal family had taken such an unexpected turn. As he looked around at the ancient stones and familiar surroundings, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had happened. His life had been changed in ways he never could have imagined, all because a 9-year-old prince had taken the time to notice that someone was struggling and had responded with extraordinary compassion. George came to say goodbye personally, and the two friends stood together quietly for a few moments, remembering the morning when a simple note had started their remarkable journey together. James knew that he would never forget the lesson George had taught him about the power of human kindness, and George knew that he would always remember what James had taught him about using privilege responsibly to help others. As James walked away from Windsor Castle for the last time as an employee, he carried with him not just gratitude for the help he had received, but also inspiration for the help he would provide to others in the future. His resignation was not an ending, but a beginning of a new chapter in which he would use his experience to make the world a little bit kinder for families facing their own difficult moments.